So, a good training program for powerlifting will have the right training variables. Training variables such as rep range matter, especially when the best rep range for an individual lifter differs from another. So what is the best rep range for powerlifting, and how do you find the best rep range for an individual lifter? Let's find out. If you're new here, my name is Norman Chung and I've been coaching powerlifting for over a decade, and in this video I will teach you everything that you need to know about rep ranges conceptually, debunk some of the common misconceptions about rep ranges, and explain to you how you can precisely find out which rep range that you should program for any given set, for any given session and any given lifter. I want to preface this video by saying that if you are new to powerlifting programming, making a decision on rep ranges isn't a long or hard task, but it just takes an initial bit of effort to understand the relevance that rep range has towards everything else, which is very important. I am going to clarify that in this video, we are going to be talking about rep ranges for the main lifts, i.e. the squat, bench and deadlift, as opposed to the accessories. There will be another video later on about the rep ranges for accessory movements. Now, when we are considering what the best rep ranges are for you or another lifter, we need to remind ourselves that the quality that we want ultimately is strength. On a side note, yes, it is true that you are likely going to get some hypertrophy gains along with it, but optimizing training variables for hypertrophy is another story. So let's define what a rep range is. Now, a rep range is simply the number of reps prescribed for a set or sets. And the best way to think about rep ranges is a distribution of repetitions of a given absolute intensity or percentage of a 1 rep max. And there is obviously an inverse relationship between the intensity and the volume that can be performed within that set. This basically means that the higher the intensity, the less volume that you can perform at that intensity. So when it comes to rep ranges, the higher the rep range, the lower the maximum intensity that you can do for that set. As a result, the rep range determines the ceiling of the absolute intensity. Now let's conceptually visualize rep ranges with respect to RPE. Now, to understand this a little bit more, let's take a look at an example of an RPE percentage chart. So let's say you have rep ranges at the top and then you have RPE down on the side. RPE is the rate of perceived exertion, which is a scale from 1 to 10. And this scale is synonymous to repetitions in reserve in this case. So RPE 10 means that there are no reps left in the tank, an all-out max-out effort. RPE 9s mean you have 1 rep left in the tank. RPE 8 means you have 2 reps left in the tank, and so on and so forth. And so if you choose a certain rep range, the highest percentage that you can use is the number on the very top row. So in my opinion, inevitably, this means that it's probably more useful to determine the intensity first before you determine the volume and rep range. Unfortunately, it's just not possible to talk about rep ranges without talking about intensity. So how does intensity determine rep ranges? So let's talk about the intensity or average intensity. When we can find out a rough range of where our optimal intensity is, we can get an idea of which rep ranges that we can use. It's worth noting that the optimal intensity between lifters is going to be different. Primarily, if you are dealing with a program for an experienced lifter, whether it's you or someone else, previous training will likely give you a massive clue to where the optimal percentage range is going to be. It is also going to depend on various other factors, including body shape, genetics, body weight, sex, and training age as well. Now, going to one of my favorite papers that I like to reference, which is the Applications of the Dose Response for Muscular Strength Development, a review of meta-analytic efficacy and reliability for designing training prescription by Peterson and colleagues. Now, they present this graph illustrating the optimal average percentage for the best strength gains in different populations. It shows the average percentage of a 1 rep max used throughout the training program. According to this graph, the optimal average intensity lies around 60 to 70% for untrained lifters, around 80% for trained individuals, and 85% for athlete populations. It's also important to note that these are averages, and what's optimal for each population group can still vary very widely. So this doesn't necessarily mean that experienced lifters will always use low reps, nor does it mean that novice lifters will always or have to use high reps. But what you can say is that more experienced lifters may need more lower rep ranges in order to get that exposure to higher intensities. And also, experienced lifters can also have exposure to higher rep ranges as well, just like novice lifters can use low rep ranges. And at the end of the day, it depends on the context of each individual lifter. Now, let's determine the context for the rep ranges and determine the mesocycle objectives. Assuming that we know that everything matters within a program, it's important to understand that the context of the phase of the training to understand how we determine all of the other training variables. So first things first, you need to determine the mesocycle objectives or the training block objectives. Now, your own programming philosophy will play a big part in how you categorize these mesocycles. Regardless, what matters is that you know what you are trying to achieve within this training block. Essentially, considering whether this is a competition prep block, a development/strength block, or a transition block, or like a deload period. So next, you then need to determine the target average intensity and weekly total reps of this mesocycle. Once you understand what you're trying to achieve in your mesocycle or training block, you may have a rougher idea of what you may want to have exposure to in terms of volume and intensity, and how you spread your volume and intensity. However, in terms of the big metrics that I personally like to consider are the target average intensity and the weekly total reps. You need to have a rough idea of intensity that you want to be working towards. And if you're not sure, check out in the description box where I list other videos where I help you figure this one out. Your peak intensity or spread of intensity may change from week to week within a mesocycle. And in order to find out the optimal average percentage, check out to see if you have historical data for that lifter. And if you do not, you may want to base it on research or guidelines. And if you do, you need to find some samples of more recent training that has worked successfully and find the average intensities, total reps and total sets prescribed for each of those lifts to get an idea. Now let's bring back the RP percentage chart. Now, when you find your average intensity range, you can then see the area of viable combinations of RPs and rep ranges, and you want to keep those highlighted. So next, you need to determine the microcycle that you are programming for. Now that you have a rough idea of what your mesocycle should be like, you then need to figure out what the training week or microcycle that you are designing. Depending on your programming approach, i.e. is it an easy week because it's an introduction week, etc. And if it is an easier week, you may want to load a little bit less on the volume and intensity side of things. And vice versa, if you are designing a week where you are pushing a little bit more. For example, the end of a block could be a peak stress week, or it could be a deload week depending on your own personal training philosophy. Or you may have a very static nature of your microcycles where you have a single microcycle that you repeat week after week. So you then need to figure out the frequency of the lifts, how far apart they are, what days they are done, etc., and which days are going to be primary days versus secondary days, and subsequently what stress and difficulty profile is of each session. You then want to determine the nature of these primary and secondary days by making decisions on exercise selection and the distribution of repetitions and volume on these days. So now we need to determine the rep range for each individual set. Once you have figured out the context of where the sets are in the grand scheme of things, you can now make an informed and logical decision on the prescription of each individual set. Depending on the session, you may have a combination of straight sets, ramping sets, pyramid sets, top or working sets. And a really important tool for determining the rep range is going back to the RP percentage chart. Now let's try and determine the best rep range for a top set. When considering the rep range for a top set, you want to consider how high the intensity needs to be in the context of that block. So for example, if this is a competition prep block, what's the highest intensity that a lifter can get away with to get enough practice and specificity without it being so high that it causes too much short and long-term fatigue? Now, this may differ from person to person as well as lift to lift as well. Then want to consider how many reps that you can afford to attribute to that intensity under the constraints of RPE. When considering the RPE, you want to consider the fatigability of that RPE. So a worked example could be that you want to expose this lifter to 2 reps at 90%. This may look like a set of 2 reps at 90%, which may be around RPE 8 or 8.5. But if you find that this lifter gets really negatively affected by RPE 8s or higher, you may want to split it into 2 sets of 1 rep, which may equate to about RP 7. So consequentially, you may end up doing 2 singles at RP 7. Or if you don't even want to do that many reps at 90% at all, you may just do a single at RP 7. Now, if it's an off-season block or any block that is not a competition prep block, you may or may not necessarily need exposure to those higher intensities. The question is how low of an intensity that you can get away with, so that you do not detrain and lose that top end maximal strength adaptation. Hypothetically, let's say that you have a lifter that needs a minimum exposure of 85%. Let's say this is a 6 rep max weight that we're dealing with. And this lifter often finds that they fatigue immediately in their back-off sets if their first set is anything like an RPE 8, RPE or higher. You may want to keep this top set at an RPE 7 or lower. So this top set at 85% can be anywhere from a single or a 3 rep set at 85%. Now let's determine the rep range for working back off or straight sets. Now when considering the rep ranges for working or back off sets, you want to consider the total repetitions that you have attributed to this training session and take away any remaining repetitions that you have attributed to a top set or sets if you have used those. And once you have done that, then you need to consider what suitable RPEs that these intensities should be. Just like RPEs for a top set, you want to think about how fatiguing RPEs are for a given set, because if an RPE has a high fatigability, subsequent sets are likely to climb an RPE at that same load, which leads to increasing in equivalent absolute intensity. Now, this may not necessarily be a problem if you then decide to have percentage decreases in load in subsequent sets, i.e. percentage dropdowns. Once you have an idea of absolute intensity and maximum RPEs, you can then see what rep ranges are viable to prescribe for that lifter. Generally speaking, spreading the reps out over more sets can be a useful strategy for managing short-term and long-term fatigue. Other practical considerations is whether there are time constraints within the session. So let's say you have quite a busy lifter and they can't train for that long. This may restrict how many sets that you allow this person to do, which may then in turn increase the rep ranges that you work with. It will have fatigue implications within the session and training weeks. Keep that in mind. Now let's go through some commonly held misconceptions about rep ranges. So the first myth is the idea that 1 to 6 reps is optimal for strength and 6 to 12 reps is optimal for hypertrophy. Now, we have just gone through the relationships between rep ranges and intensity. Now we know that rep ranges do not necessarily tell us enough about what these sets are like as a stimulus. When you go back to general population guidelines, there's often this misrepresentation that to increase strength, you need to be training in the 1 to 6 reps, and for hypertrophy, you want to focus on 6 to 12 reps. And then for muscular endurance, you need to be training 12 to 15 reps or more. And it's no wonder why people often think that these qualities occur in a very discrete fashion. In reality, all of these qualities are developed to varying degrees when being exposed to each rep range. But in the context of strength or powerlifting, it's not obvious that low reps are going to necessarily be a more optimal stimulus, knowing that the average intensity that's optimal for people ranges based on genetics and training experience. But that's not necessarily to say that you shouldn't or couldn't benefit from some exposure to low reps. So the next myth is that the idea that peak and tapers need to only have low rep ranges. So the traditional approach to peak and tapers is that specificity needs to increase leading into a competition. So not only does this apply to exercise selection, it also applies to the training stimulus. And I agree to an extent that it seems to be sensible that having more exposure to specificity can best prep you for a competition. But the idea that the whole program needs to suddenly have a total constraint on rep ranges and only expose yourself to rep ranges of less than 5 or intensity above a certain amount is not necessary. Because if you benefited from high reps, implying lower intensity, what is apparent is that the most optimal or triggering fastest rate of progress for you was being exposed to those high reps. And to an extent, this stimulus was responsible for upholding this level of performance. And so it's not obvious that opting to move away from this rep range and intensity will be better for maintaining that level of performance. And if we refer back to this graph, we know that the average optimal intensity has the Goldilocks zone. And that's why nowadays, coaches have realized this and often have a training week that don't look too dissimilar to what may have been done several months prior. So that's the end of the video. If you did find this video useful, please click like, subscribe, and share this video to someone who might benefit from it as well. And I'll see you guys on the next one.